Today on the Burning Archive, I ask, can we understand Russian history if we do not understand the Horde? Not the Horde from World of Warcraft, but the Golden Horde, the successor to the Mongol Empire, and how the Mongol Empire changed not just Russia, but changed the world. It is part of my series on the Black Legend of Russian history, where I am looking at the time broadly from 1200 to 1500 CE, that is sometimes referred to as the Mongol or Tatar Yoke. And this is an episode that will flip your understanding of the nature of both Russia and how the Mongol Empire affected world history. It will take you to a deeper understanding of one of those other caricatures of world history after looking at Ivan the Terrible, yes, Genghis Khan of the Mongol Empire, and how intertwined Russia, Central Asia, and Eurasia have always been. Was the Mongol Yoke, in fact, the Mongol Exchange, as important for world history as the Columbian Exchange between the Eurasia and the Americas after Columbus discovered America? I am Jeff Rich. I am an independent author and historian these days. And the Burning Archive explores how the past makes itself felt in your lives today and how we can live better with the past in the present, not just rage against it. And I will have more info on my content and how you can support me later in the show, help support me putting out this content later in the show. But this is the 10th episode in my series on Russian history, and it presents the stories of Russia and the Russian world, free of the black legend which I described back in episode 65, recorded back in August 2022, where I described the idea of the black legend of Russian history put out in an excellent book by Mark B. Smith called The Russia Anxiety, describing the various cycles of fear, hatred and contempt towards Russia in Western culture, Western historiography, and how a better appreciation of the richness and complexity of Russian history can free you of that particular black legend or Russia anxiety. It will free you of the idea that Russia is a country cursed by despotism to be feared, hated or ignored. And this episode in particular, I think, expands our idea of what exactly is Russian history, because it is about the time when the Russian and the Ukrainian and Polish-Lithuanian and many other, I guess, Russian world, former Soviet Union sort of territories were actually part of the Mongol Empire, ruled by the descendants of Genghis or Genghis Khan. Genghis is the more correct version of his name. And it is about the time known traditionally as the Mongol or Tatar Yoke, although that term itself is really a later invention from about the 16th or 17th century. It was not a term people used about their situation at the time. But this Mongol yoke, this Tatar yoke, may be better known not just in Russian but in world history as the Mongol Exchange, and that is a term I take from and another outstanding recent history book by Marie Favreau, her award-winning book of last year, The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World. And this period, 1200 to 1500 roughly, with a few, edges around it, is a time when Mongol law, politics and culture, not just, marauding raiders and savage military generals, not just Mongol warfare, that Mongol law, politics and culture created a broad church for societies across the whole of Eurasia, from Beijing to Paris, to influence and learn from each other. People even talk about the Pax Mongoliaca, like the Pax Romana or the Pax Americana. And as an example of that, let's go back in time to 1332, to a place on the Volga River, right in the heart of southern Russia. And there are, I guess, few more iconic images of traditional Russia than the song of the Volga boatmen, yo, heave, ho, and all that sort of stuff. Or the memory of the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, the city now renamed Volgograd, that sits on the great Volga River that has carried people, goods, ideas, soldiers, traders, from the frozen north of Scandinavia and northern Eurasia to Central Asia throughout Russia's history. It's one of the great north-south running rivers that connects Russia to all parts of Eurasia. And here in 1332, the Muslim traveller Ibn Battuta arrived at the great city of Sarai, Sarai, the great capital of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state. And it was Genghis Khan's successor state. And this great city is the centre of trade and cultural exchange from Beijing or even Korea to Paris. And Ibn Battuta wrote up his travels, and this is what he said about this city, which is located surely in the spiritual heartland of Russia, but describes the capital city of the Golden Horde. The city of Al-Sarraj is his Arabic version of Sarai, is one of the finest of cities of boundless size, situated in a plain, choked with the throng of its inhabitants, and possessing good bazaars and broad streets. He described how there is a day's walk from one side of the city to the other, full of good housing. And then says there are various groups of people among its inhabitants. These include the Mughals, which I think is his term for the Mongols, who are the dwellers in this country, and its sultans, and some of whom are Muslims. Then the Az or Alans, who are Muslims, the Kipchak, the Cumans, the Jakas, the Circassians, the Rus, the Russians, and the Rum, the Romans. All of these are Christians. Each group lives in a separate quarter with its own bazaars. Merchants and strangers from the two Iraqs, Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere live in a quarter which is surrounded by a wall for the protection of the properties of the merchants. The Sultan's palace in it is called Altun Tash, meaning gold head. What an incredibly diverse and culturally rich place. And the Sultan Ibn Battuta was referring to was in fact the Khan of the Golden Horde, the emperor, if you like, of the Mongol Empire. And this Khan at this time was also in effect the ruler, the ultimate ruler, if you like, the Tsar of Russia. Tsar was the word Russians used for the Khan, which they later adopted for their own ruler. So I think that image and that, primary source, that document from Ibn Battuta gives you a sense of a different image, I guess, of Russian history to the standard, perhaps, assumptions you might have. But let me also paint the scene a little bit more. So the period I'm talking about in this podcast is roughly from 1200 to 1500. And it really kicks off, I guess, with Genghis Khan in Mongolia, or I guess the area we now know as Mongolia, uniting the various groups, relatively small sort of little statelets that were operating in that area and forming a more unified Mongol horde, or ulus. And he began from the 2020s to plan major Mongol invasions of Russia and Europe. He died in 2027, and the invasions ultimately happened in the late did I say 2027? He died in 1227. And then the invasions of the Russian areas really ultimately happened in between 1237 and 41, and so began, I guess, the period of the Mongol or Tatar Yoke, which did not really end, or was traditionally been dated as ending around about 1480, when there was basically a military victory for the local Russians, let's call them, in the Ugra River, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And this term, the Mongol or the Tatar Yoke, describes this period when a whole group of Russian principalities, of which Muscovy was one, or Moscow if you like, Muscovy was one, Novgorod was another, and a range of other towns, including Kiev, were suborned to Mongol or rulers of the horde and paid taxes or tribute to them. It wasn't a term invented at the time or used at the time, but was invented much later in the 1560s and 1570s, in the sort of period of the late era of Ivan the Terrible, who of course was fighting the Crimean Tatars and had defeated the horde in Kazan and Astrakhan in this period. The Horde, or Golden Horde, also known as in more their actual language as the Juche Ulus, the White Horde, or the Kipchak Khanate, broke up into several groups, especially after the impact of the plague, the Great Black Death in the 1340s. This kind of this great federation, if you like, of nomadic and settled states covered an enormous area of Eurasia. It included like the Volga River and the Bulgars, the Kipchak Steppe, the Crimea, the Caucasus, the Western Siberia, Central Asia, all the way into Western Europe, the Don, the Dniester, and the Dnieper River, of course, that runs through Kiev today. And it also included a couple of the major Silk Road trade routes. A couple of the key figures of the Golden Horde, who we'll maybe hear a little bit more of later, but to help situate them, was founded by a man called Batu, who was one of the descendants of Genghis Khan. And the thing about the various Khanates of the Golden Horde was they all owed some fidelity, or were descendants of Genghis Khan. Another key figure was a man called Uzbek, as in Uzbekistan, who in fact converted the horde to Islam and was also a very crucial figure in Russian history. You might even say he was the first Muslim Tsar of Russia. I'm twisting the precise meaning of those terms a little bit, but just for a little bit of podcast colour and light. And some key figures on the Russian side that you might have heard of in just general, culture. Alexander Nevsky, the one who Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg is named after. He was both the Prince of Kiev and of Novgorod, and a frequent traveller to Sarai, where Ibn Battuta visited. In fact, his father, Alexander Nevsky's father, in fact died in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, and he was a very close ally of the Mongols. There was a man known as Dmitry Donskoy, who was a prince of Muscovy, who fought against the Horde in 1380. There was a number of Ivan the Terrible's ancestors, including Ivan III, Ivan the Terrible's grandfather, who refused to pay tribute to the Horde, ultimately in the 1480s. And in terms of cultural figures, the great religious icon painter Andrei Rublev practiced his art in Novgorod in this era. Before we go on, just let it sink in, that reversal of perspective here in thinking about Russian history. Russia is not facing Europe as some poor cousin jealous of what's going on in Paris and London. Russia is facing Eurasia, and the great power is not the Holy Roman Empire or the papacy or Merry England. It is the Mongols and the Golden Horde. They are the centre of wealth, power, trade routes, diplomacy and statecraft in Eurasia. Indeed, in Marie Favrot's book, The Horde, she writes how at one point merchants could navigate from the Volga, which goes effectively all the way up to the Baltic Sea for various portage methods, down to the Caspian Sea, to the Nile in Africa, and that there were lucrative trade channels east, west and north, south that were secured by this great Mongol Empire. Indeed, there was also a Mongol road to Lviv, which was for many years part of Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth, but of course is now in the western part of Ukraine. And that Mongol road to Lviv was absolutely essential to the wealth of the Hanseatic League, as in the sort of famous, German trading group of cities in the European German Middle Ages. Mongols controlled from China to Hungary, and Wallachia and Bulgaria were the Mongol gateway to Europe. The whole sense of where Europe and Russia were positioned relative to each other is different to what one's normal assumption is. But this Mongol Empire operated through networks, not through I guess, building castles and territories. It operated through networks as a great nomadic empire. And it, in a funny kind of way, was kind of a 13th, 14th century version of the One Belt, One Road initiative. It also requires us to sort of look at maps differently, not just looking at, I guess, single nations coloured in blocks of territory, but seeing the mobile networks supported by great trading rivers or mobile populations with diverse cultures and people moving across roads, rivers, steppes and oceans in these complex networks that carried with them wealth, ideas, disease and power. Indeed, the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China, which led to the establishment of the Ming dynasty, that was in fact the fall of the Mongol, the sort of Mongol dynasty controlling China. And that had major geopolitical consequences. In the 1300s, in effect, the Mongols withdrew from China, and it accelerated the process of disintegration of the Horde. In another flip, we really need to think of the Mongols as not marauding, warlike monsters, but gifted politicians and diplomats and traders with a surprising flexibility and acceptance of diversity. And this is the story told in Marie Favreau's wonderful book, The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World. And it's where she describes the idea of the Mongol Exchange. So in the early part of her book, she writes that historians used to call the unprecedented commercial boom of this era, the 1200s and 1300s, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, in reference to the post-conquest stability of the Mongol dominions and the far-flung exchange that stability enabled. But there was also a lot of war, so peace is a bit of a misnomer. I guess you'd probably say the same thing about the Pax Americana. But she proposes to instead examine this period as the Mongol Exchange, a macro, and here I quote, a macro-historical phenomenon on par with such world-shaping phenomena as the trans-Saharan trade or the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange being the movement of plants, animals, and metals and diseases between the Americas and Eurasia after 1492. Understood as the Mongol Exchange, the global moment created by Genghis Khan's successors comes into focus. It is, she says, a monumental shift that facilitated the flourishing of art, the development of skilled crafts, and the progress of research in various areas such as botany, medicine, astronomy, measurement systems, and historiography. The increased production and circulation of manufactured objects, often driven by Mongol leaders themselves, is another major effect of this world phenomenon. And indeed, the history of Russia was also a very crucial part of the Mongol Exchange. So I hope you sort of see the change of the ready-made assumptions that you might have about, I guess, the history of Eurasia and the role of different peoples in it, and how those peoples are all, in neat little territories and all that sort of stuff. and also change your image of the Mongols away from some terrifying, violent Genghis Khan, captured in the idea of someone being, politics being to the right of Genghis Khan, to a much more sophisticated understanding of the extraordinary role of this nomadic empire in shaping the history of the world, and especially the history of Russia. And so I'm going to turn now to a bit of a brief narrative overview of this period, between 1200 to 1500, to just put the spine down there before discussing a few of the key main points about it that are really relevant to the idea of the Black Legend of Russian history. So in the period between 1200 and 1240, so right at the start of this period, the important thing to understand is what we now know of as Russia, what we now know as Ukraine, what we now know even as Poland and Lithuania, is all broken up in these small little principalities or microstates. And if you've ever played the game Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis, you would have seen many of these little regional principalities and even played their characters. And at that point, Moscow, the later capital of Russia, is not a terribly important city or state principality, but Novgorod in the north is, and Kiev to the south is. But there's also major centres like Vladimir and Tver, and others. And if you go to Russia, I think they talk about the Golden Circle, some of the fabulous old churches in some of these cities, which are traditional centres of Russian culture. But in the early period, from 1200 to 1240, there's an enormous amount of contention over the control of Kiev. It's almost a prefiguration of the 20th or 21st century, one might say, and a lot of back and forward. But then in 1223, the Tatars, or the Mongols, the Horde, and I should also add here just terminology, I guess, the Horde, unless of course you play World of Warcraft on that side, is might have negative connotations for you, but it was, Marie Favreau says, effectively the term that the Mongols themselves used to describe their, obviously in their own language, but it was more or less the term that they used to describe themselves. So I'll just move between the various terms. And Tatars is both a particular little, ethnic group, but also a term that the Russians tended to use for the Mongols as a whole, particularly later on. And they were particularly important down in Crimea, as we heard in the last episode. So the Horde, the Tatars, the Mongols, in 1223 start to defeat the various principalities of Russia and establish control over them. And then in 1240, the Horde comes in and captures Kiev. In fact, it decimates Kiev. Many people leave, many people flee further north, and in other areas, and it's effectively a ruined city, and it takes many years before it re-establishes itself. And at the same time, Alexander Nevsky, who I mentioned, Alexander Nevsky of Nevsky Prospect, has some famous battles with the Swedes on the Neva, and in 1242 with the Teutonic Knights at Lake Chud, a famous battle represented in film and in art on many occasions. Then in 1243, reflecting the demotion in status of Kiev after the Mongol invasion there, the Khan of the Horde, Khan Batu, appoints Grand Prince Yaroslav of Vladimir, one of those other now minor cities of Russia, but one of the contending principalities in this period, sometimes known as the Appanage period, referring to these principalities being sort of dependence upon the Tatar rulers. The Khan, Batu, appoints the Prince of Vladimir rather than the Prince of Kiev as the the dominant principality within, if you like, the Russian Federation. And so it kicks off, I guess, a process that's going to continue for quite some time about which of these fragmented Russian principalities is most in favour with the Mongol overlords. In 1263, Alexander Nevsky dies, so he had a pretty good run. And then in 1299, reflecting the change in influence, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Metropolitan, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, moves the religious capital from Kiev to Vladimir. Then in 1300, a whole set of new contenders for favour of the Khan emerge, not just Vladimir and Kiev, but now the principalities of Tver, T-B-E-R, and Moscow, or Muscovy, start fighting for the favour of the Khan. And at this time, the principality of Tver is the one which is largely on top. And if you go to Moscow, one of the main streets, or I guess, one of the main streets of Moscow coming out from the Kremlin and the Red Square is Tverskaya, or Tver Street. Tverskaya Ulitsa. Then in 1318, Khan Uzbek, who I mentioned before, initiates what Marie Favreau describes as world historic change, in that he, in this decades-long fight for relative power and position of the different principalities in the sort of Russian horde, let's call it, he decides to favour Muscovy, or Moscow, and executes the Prince of Tver and a number of his descendants. So it's a dramatic key moment when power, wealth, and cultural influence switch into Moscow, and Moscow starts centralising and consolidating its power. Between 1331, again, one of Ivan the Terrible's, in fact, the first Ivan the Terrible was Ivan IV, the first Ivan to rule Muscovy was Ivan Danilovich, known as Ivan Kalita, or Ivan the Moneybags, who bought up many territories and consolidated, I guess, the economic power and the land and the estates controlled by the Grand Prince of Muscovy. Then in 1340, again, something of profound significance happens in Eurasian history, which is the Black Death. The great plagues of Black Death start to break out all over Eurasia, including in Russia, in what we think of as Russia today. It deeply, deeply affected the Horde, the Mongol Empire, and contributes to some of its disintegration. And it obviously has huge, it has a catastrophic impact that was well known on populations, but that impact is also happening in Russia, not just in Italy or England. It's happening in Egypt, it's happening in Mongolia, it's happening in Central Asia. Then if we skip forward a bit, we go to 1362, where Dmitry Donskoy becomes the Grand Prince of both Muscovy and Vladimir. So the process of starting to not just control more territory, but to actually consolidate some of these fragmented states begins. And then in 1380, Dmitry Donskoy fights a battle with some armies of the Horde, which he wins, and that battle, the Battle of Kulikovo, is certainly honoured in nationalist Russian historiography as one of the, or potentially the key moment when, the Russian nation threw off the Mongol yoke, threw off the Tatar yoke. But it was not quite so. There was still significant power and influence being exercised by the Mongol Khan. But then in 1453, we have, of course, the fall of Constantinople, the collapse of the centre of the Orthodox religious world, and the shift of that religious power not just to Eastern Europe, but to Russia and to Moscow. And then in 1462, Ivan III, Ivan the Terrible's grandfather, becomes the Grand Prince of Muscovy, and then it is he who in 1480 has a sort of like a standoff with the Horde at the river Ugra, where ultimately there's some kind of negotiation, and despite Ivan III's refusal to pay the taxes and tributes to the Horde that he had done for, or that various Russian princes had done for 250 years at that point, ultimately the Horde armies did not press the issue and withdrew, partly because of the difficulties they were experiencing with their own, with other challenges in Central Asia. So that's the narrative. It's a fascinating narrative. It's a story that has often been told. It's in a very nationalistic way of throwing off the Mongol yoke, but in fact it's actually a story of extraordinary intermingling and mutual influence between the Mongol Central Asian peoples and nomadic peoples and the people who we tend to think of as in northwest Russia. And I've got, I think, 4 or 5 key thematic points to draw out from this narrative. And the first of those is just to reiterate how the rise of Muscovy, the centrality of Moscow to the Russian state, and Russian power and Russian economy begins in this era, and it would not have happened without the Horde, because they play the crucial role, I guess, in being the sponsor and the powerful ally who the lower status state, Muscovy, works together with to get rid of the sort of in-between powers like Kiev and Tver at this stage. And that it shows that rise of Muscovy is not happening in a sort of cut-off sort of world that's remote from civilization. It's they are rising by allying with the most powerful state, the most wealthy, powerful trade network in the world. They're not at all, well, at least in the Eurasian world at that point, they're not at all cut off from civilization. They are the partners of the Horde at this time. Again, we need to sort of drop the blinkered view of Russian history that sort of just looks at Western Europe as the core of all developments, and then it's when Russia catches up with Western Europe that things really seem to count. The second big theme is about the just the impact of the years of this, I guess, political and economic partnership between the Horde and the various Russian principalities. Its profound impact on political and social institutions in Russia, and the creativity, I guess, of the Mongol Empire in shaping those institutions. For example, the Mongols had the world's best postal service in this era, way superior to anything that could be found in Western Europe, and it was something that Russia benefited from. Russia, of course, is an enormous place, and so having effective communications is pretty important to ruling such a place. Another aspect of that is multilingualism. Russia in this area is a multilingual place. Even Ivan the Terrible was known to speak some Tatar, and there were many others in the courts who did as well. And although it's had that impact, and I guess that creative impact as well, I guess the association of the Mongols with, blood-curdling violence and dynastic authoritarianism has had an impact on the perceptions, or the how people feel about that inheritance from the Mongol era. Charles Halperin, for example, has written, and that's been a long debate, I guess, within Russian culture and within Russian history. I think I've referred to it before in terms of the debates within Russia around Scythianism and Eurasianism, that sort of thing. Charles Halperin, who is a American historian of Russia, talks about how Russia borrowed the institutions of their absentee conquerors, and again, this tends to use what Marie Favreau would probably say are outdated images of the Mongols to associate that borrowing, that it's part of the argument that there's a kind of an original sin in the Russian state, that it's contaminated by dynastic authoritarianism, religious intolerance, and ideologically motivated silence. It's a medieval frontier society that has some bad blood. But Marie Favreau is much more positive and informed about this this impact on political and social institutions. She says, crucially, the Mongols were extraordinarily skillful and creative, political leaders, that they asked Russian princes to collect taxes without interfering with the land holding system that operated there, so that, and here I quote, they could share the fruits of their conquests with the sons of those they had banished. Administrative, legal, land management reforms were actually at the heart of the Mongol Empire, not just running in with horses, bows and arrows. The Mongols also imposed law and order, provided safety and security, including, for example, banning weapons within cities, that empowered local elites and enabled secure conditions for artisans, merchants, and religious people. It was part of the prosperity. That law and order actually was part of the success of the Hanseatic League, of the wealth of Novgorod, and later of Moscow. And they also implemented what was called the Tarkan system, which provided a tax exemption for the Orthodox Church, which provided, it kind of supported the regime that conferred great legitimacy on the regime, and also crucially, at a crucial time, supported the development of the Orthodox Church, especially during that era that, as you know, the Byzantine Church was weakening and ultimately removed from Constantinople, and this led to a very significant growth in the role of the Orthodox Church, and it was part of the foundation of the Church's role in Russian history, the Orthodox Church's role in Russian history, which is very, very significant. But this also, Marie Favreau says, is in contrast perhaps to the attitudes to other, because the Mongols were not Christians, the attitudes towards other religions displayed in, like, Crusader Christians or within the Islamic dhimmi system, where people were tolerated but were seen as lesser subjects. It was a system that co-opted elites rather than integrating subjects. And all these systems had an especially beneficial impact on Novgorod. And Novgorod, of course, featured in the episode on Ivan the Terrible and his extraordinary raid and massacre of Novgorod. And it's perhaps not a city that people are terribly aware of, but Novgorod was, in this era, it was in fact at the crossroads of the various trade routes that ran north, south, east, west across Eurasia. In many ways, it was at the heart of the success of the Hanseatic League. and that success was very much secured by the Mongol Empire. Again, if I quote Marie Favreau, she says, "Such developments might have been impossible without the Mongols' protection, political acumen, and liberal trade policies, security and free passage for merchants and goods, privileged treatment for elites, clergy, traders and artisans, carefully planned tax and land regimes, and mostly indirect governance were the stuff of prosperity for Russian subjects and Mongols alike." The Mongols were not just military geniuses, they actually governed their states rather well. Now the third or fourth point, general thematic point I'd bring out again is that this period shows that Russian history has always been about the history of Eurasian peoples. It's always been a Eurasian history, a history of a multi-ethnic society. Just think back to that description by Ibn Battuta of the Mongol capital, the Horde's capital in Sarai, and the many different peoples from all around the world with different religions who were mingling there. And enabling that was no accident. In fact, what Marie Favreau points out, that the Mongols had a bit of a genius for the flexible adaptation of their law and practice with their encounters with other cultures, and that this applied to Russia as well. So, for example, there was various Russian traditions about how they would sell land, which were linked to ideas of sort of ancestral connections to the land, which the Mongols incorporated and adapted to and responded flexibly with in their sort of legal and administrative arrangements. So rather than it being this oppressive Mongol yoke, it's actually quite a enabling Mongol exchange of ideas. And that's the final point, I guess, about some of the extraordinary cultural legacies of this time. There's clearly the various direct connections between Mongol culture and Russian culture, including in language. There's multiple Mongol words that are in Russian, including the word for money, diengi. There's the Mongol yoke is actually part of the growth of the role and power of the Orthodox Church at a very crucial time. The protection of that church enables the great icon painters like Andrei Rublev and the development of the legends of Alexander Nevsky. And contrary to much later nationalist and Western historiography, the Mongol political, legal, social, cultural traditions, which crossed Eurasia in this great Mongol exchange, were fundamental to how states operated across Eurasia. Marie Favreau writes that political practices and concepts developed by Genghis Khan supplied the symbolic and institutional framework of the state in early modern Iran, China, Central Asia, along with Russia. It didn't all come from Westminster and ancient Greece and Rome. There are many traditions of politics and government and institutions and culture used to govern society that have other sources and have adapted to other cultures. So finally, in wrapping up this episode, again, there's this, I guess, tradition of synthesizing diversity within the Mongol tradition that perhaps is also passed into some of the Russian historical tradition, contrary to the black legend of Russian history. Marie Favreau says that Mongols' power was, quote, based on their ability to synthesize diversity, to control resources without controlling societies, and possess power without possessing space. Perhaps there is even a distant echo of this practice in Vladimir Putin's recent evocation of a symphony of civilizations to govern the multipolar world that can draw on different sets of democratic political traditions other than the liberal West. As Marie Favreau says, the nomads, the Mongols, the nomadic Mongols, through their mutual formation of the Russian state, drove world history in their distinctive imperial manner. It's an extraordinary mind shift if you do read Marie Favreau's fabulous book, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes for the show. But absolutely fabulous book, and it's well worth sort of changing your cliched images of Genghis Khan and the role of the Mongol Empire. Next week, we turn to the penultimate in the series on Russian history. We're going to look at Kievan Rus, which perhaps brings us back in a funny sort of way to contemporary debates about Ukraine and Russia. So until then, just before I go, let me just mention to everyone that I've now started a YouTube channel, the Burning Archive YouTube channel, that I'm sort of reposting some of the older podcasts with sort of images and videos, as well as doing fresh video only kind of content or video first content on that YouTube channel. So do check that out and support me by subscribing to the YouTube channel. And I've also released my book, which is a collection of essays and fragments that I've written over the last 5 to 7 years, called From the Burning Archive. And you can buy that at Amazon or other online retailers. So I'd love it if you showed your support for this now retired government official and keen student of history, culture and geopolitics by both subscribing to the YouTube channel and buying the book. Okay, until next time, do remember, what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.